How weird can you get with your will? What can you leave people? What kind of crazy demands can you make? Who steps in if your final wish just goes too far? Let's answer the age-old question, where there's a will, is there a way? On today's episode of Hammer's Law. Welcome back. I'm attorney Darryl Isaacs, the Hammer. Today, we're talking about wills.
I guess this will be my last will and testament.
That's right, those documents you always see stuffy attorneys reading to sad family members in movies and TV shows. Most people don't know what they are, but a lot of people don't have one because no one likes to think about dying.
I don't want to die. I don't want to die.
And leaving all their stuff behind. It's kind of a bummer to think about it, but they're important. That's why I want to talk about some of the wild, amazing, weird things that people have put in their wills. Once you hear some of these, maybe you'll be inspired to get your own unique will. Let's start with some fun ones. One of the things you can put in your will, throwing a party. You would be surprised how many people have stipulated that they wanted people to have a party in their honor. Now, keep in mind, in a will, you're not commanding people to do something. You're simply instructing where your money and property go. But if you get creative, you can designate some of your money to a party for whoever you want. That's exactly what Roger Brown did. Roger was a 67-year-old man who sadly lost his battle with prostate cancer in 2013. But Roger wanted his friends to remember him fondly, and he left a special surprise to 7 of his closest friends. He set aside 3,500 pounds, which was worth about $5,000 at the time, for his friends to have an alcohol-fueled blowout. And they did him proud. Who wouldn't, right? You're honoring your late friend's final wish, and you get a trip and a free booze. Win-win. Roger Brown wasn't the only one who left a party in their will. Janis Joplin, the talented singer who was known to be quite a partier herself, left a similar message for her friends. She lived a short and troubled life, passing away at the tragically young age of 27 in 1970. Her will left $2,500 and instructions for her friends and acquaintances to gather for a final farewell. Other than throwing a party, what else can you do with your will? You can throw some shade. That's right. There's no better time to get the final word in than when it's literally your final word. Now keep in mind, I always try to be positive, so I'm not recommending that you use your last will and testament to take a shot at somebody. But since some people have already done that, let's talk about them. There's no better place to start than with William Shakespeare. He's generally considered the greatest writer in history. But there's no bigger tragedy than what he wrote in his last will and testament for his wife, Anne Hathaway. While Shakespeare left almost everything he had to his daughter, Susanna, he made sure to put in his will that his wife could have a few pieces of furniture, including what he described as my second best bed. Wow. You may have thought, to be or not to be were Shakespeare's most memorable words, but my second best bed is one I will never forget. Shakespeare may be the most famous person to leave a bummer of a message for his wife in his will, but he's not the only one. For example, back in 1888, a 70-year-old man named Albert Orton left his wife just one farthing in his will. That's the British version of a penny. 1 penny. And why did Albert decide to leave his wife so little? He wanted her to know she hurt his feelings by calling him a rotten old pig. But to be fair, she only called him that because he wouldn't stop passing gas. But maybe the most impressive level of pettiness shown in a will comes from a Portuguese aristocrat. I'm going to try and say his name, but it's a mouthful. So we will also put it on the screen. Luis Carlos de Norfa Cabral de Carmel. Luis was a wealthy man who inherited a lot of money, but he didn't live a very happy life. He had very few friends and he had no children to pass his money along to. But he absolutely refused to let his money go to the state. So when he died in 2001, there were some people who were surprised to find out that they had received an inheritance from him. 70 people. That's right. Luis created a will where he left his money to 70 total strangers that he chose from random out of the Lisbon phone book. There's no topping that. Moving on to another thing you can do with your will, not everyone is worried about getting the final word. Some people just aren't ready to go, which brings us to the next category, sticking around. I'm not going to tell you that you can use your will to live forever or come back from the dead, but there are a few people who have definitely tried it. Let's start with Jeremy Bentham. He was an English philosopher who passed away at the age of 84 in 1832. He had known for many years that he would donate his body to be dissected by his physician friend. But then towards the end of his life, he raised the stakes. He put in his will that after his friends dissected him, he wanted his friend to reassemble parts of his body, including his head and entire skeleton, so it could sit in a glass case as what Bentham described as his auto icon. And you know what? His friend did it. Jeremy's head didn't preserve very well, so they replaced it with a wax one that had Jeremy's real hair on it. And to this day, his body sits on a public display in a glass case on campus at the University College of London. This next guy also wanted to stick around after he died, but he wasn't as literal as Jeremy Bentham. John Bowman was a man who made his fortune as a tanner in Vermont, but tragedy took his wife and daughter away from him less than a year apart. He became obsessed with the idea of reincarnation, and he spent much of his money preparing his home for when his family returned. He believed so much that he and his family would be reincarnated and return to their home that he put in his will, when he died in 1891, he set aside $50,000 in a trust. That trust would pay the servants to keep running the house and serving dinner every night in anticipation of John and his family returning home. The servants continued to serve dinner every night to no one for almost 60 years, all the way until 1950 when the money in the trust ran out. That proves you can't take it with you, and some people still try. That brings us to the next thing you can do in your will. Repurpose the part. No matter what you believe, one thing is true for everyone that dies. You're not using your body anymore. So some people got creative with what to do with what they left behind. Napoleon Bonaparte, the famed military commander and French emperor, had an unusual request. He had a lot of money and land and valuables that he left to various people. But then there's a bit about his hair. This is what he wrote in his will. Marshal shall preserve my hair and cause a bracelet to be made of it with a little gold clasp to be sent to the Empress Maria Luzia, to my mother, and to each of my brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, the cardinal, and one of my larger size for my son. He basically asked his entire family to wear Napoleon hair bracelets. That's certainly one way to be remembered. But this next guy went a step further and maybe one step too far. Let me tell you about Solomon Sanborn. He was a proud hat maker, a proud Massachusetts resident, and an even prouder American patriot right up until he passed away in 1871. He loved stories of triumph from the Revolutionary War, in particular, the Battle of Bunker Hill. So far, he seems like a normal, red-blooded, patriotic guy, right? Well, then there's this part. When he died, he stipulated in his will that his body be given to his doctor friend so he could carefully remove the skin from his body. Yes, you heard that right. But we're not done yet. Solomon wanted his doctor friend to take that skin and turn it into 2 drum heads. And he wanted those drums to be given to a drummer who would go to the Bunker Hill Memorial on the anniversary of the battle every year and have the drummer play the rhythm of Yankee Doodle on his drum heads made of his skin. Yikes! I respect his dedication to what he loved, but I don't know how I feel about turning myself into a musical instrument that Hannibal Lecter would love. Speaking of people dedicated to what they love, our next group is called You Are What You Do. Some people love something so much that they want to be immortalized with it, and they make that clear in their will. Fred Beyer was the inventor of the original Pringles potato chip tube. Gosh knows I've eaten a lot of those. You guessed it. He wanted to be cremated and buried in a Pringles can. The same thing for Ed Hedrick, a toy inventor who perfected the modern Frisbee as we know it. Guess what he wanted to be turned into after his death? That's right. He had his ashes mixed into a limited supply of Frisbees for his friends and family. Gross. And by the way, if you want one, you can still buy them online and go throw around a piece of Ed in the park with your friends. Mark Grunewald was a comic book writer and editor for Marvel Comics. His most well-known work was a series called Squadron Supreme. After he passed, he requested that his ashes be mixed with the ink that would be used to print anthology collection of his Squadron Supreme stories. He didn't just write those stories, he used his final wishes to become the writing in these stories. And let's not forget veteran theatrical stagehand John Reed. He loved the theater and was so proud to be part of it. So when he died, he left his own skull to a theater in Philadelphia so they could use it as the skull in the famous gravedigger scene in Hamlet. Now, Not everyone writing a will thinks only of themselves. There are people who leave elaborate instructions to care for those they've left behind. For instance, when comedian Jack Benny died in 1974, he left behind a widow by the name of Mary Livingston. And every single day after Jack passed away, Mary received one stem rose. He had arranged in his will a provision to deliver her one red rose every day for the rest of her life. I mean, gotta love Jack Benny, and that's a great thing. The author of Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson, did something equally kind, but probably not legally binding. He was friends with a woman named Annie Ide, whose birthday was on Christmas. She had confided in him that she always felt cheated out of having a real birthday because of it. So when Stevenson died in 1894, he bequeathed her his own birthday of November 13th. In Stevenson's own words from his will, I charge her to use my said birthday with moderation and humanity. The said birthday not being so young as it once was, and having carried me in a very satisfactory manner since I can remember. Sometimes people think they're doing something nice, but it goes badly. Leona Helmsley, and God knows we all remember her, the billionaire property developer who died in 2007, left $12 million to her 9-year-old Maltese dog, Trouble. A judge reduced it from 12 to 2 million, but some people were so angry about it that the dog actually had to be hidden from the public because of threats of kidnapping and death. Do you know how bad it has to be for the general public to want to threaten a dog? And that brings us to our last few things you can do with your will, which I'm calling jumping through hoops. This is when someone promises to leave their friends or family something, but it comes with strings attached. Some of them are weird, but not a big deal. Like in the case of Mr. Henry Budd. Henry had 2 sons and a sizable estate at the time he passed away in 1862. He left his estate to his sons, but with one rule: neither of them could grow mustaches. He wrote in his will that if either of them grew one, they would immediately have their portion of the estate revoked. That's one expensive cookie duster. If Henry Budd's demand seemed like a cruel and petty thing to put in your will, just wait until you meet Wellington Burt. Wellington was a millionaire in Michigan who passed away in the early 1900s. I don't know what all his family members could have done to get him as mad as he was at the end, but it must have been something serious, because in his will, he specified that his enormous wealth would not be passed on to his descendants until 21 years after his youngest grandchild had passed away. Sorry, kids and grandkids, Wellington has had enough of you. His youngest granddaughter died in 1989, and 21 years later, in 2010, his $110 million estate was divided up amongst a dozen people who never even knew the relative left it to them. That's a pretty cruel will, and sometimes people put things in wills that are so unfair, cruel, or impossible to fulfill that someone has to step in and say, sorry, that's a no-go. Our last will is a perfect example of that. There was a lawyer in Iowa named T.M. Zink. He had a cool name, but he was not a very cool guy. Mr. Zink loved libraries, but not as much as he hated women. So when he died in 1930, he put $50,000 of his wealth into a trust to build what he called the Zink Womanless Library. He wanted to build a library with signs stating, "No women admitted," at the entrances. But that wasn't all. No, he also wanted the library to be stocked with only books written by men. As a lawyer, I have to say, he obviously didn't understand his own career, because lawyers are supposed to use the law to get justice, not to use money and complicated rules to deprive people of things like education and entertainment. You'll be glad to hear that his family contested the will after he died. Almost 100 years later, there is still no Zink Womanless Library, and the thing Zink is remembered for best is the horrible story I just told you about him. And there you have it, the wildest uses of last will and testament. Now that you've seen all the things you can do with a will, I hope you'll decide it's not so scary to take some time to think about getting your own. And do me a favor, if I inspired you to get a will made for yourself, can you add it in the will somewhere that Darryl the Hammer Isaacs is the best attorney ever? Of course, you know I'm kidding. But that way, your whole family will get to watch another lawyer say that about me. Thanks for watching Hammer's Law, and be sure to subscribe for more fun and informative legal content.